Welcome, Daniel, and congrats on your new book. Is this your first book?
It is. It's my first book. Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, A Trick of the Mind. Did you have anything to do with the cover?
I approve the cover, but actually, it's always I'm always very impressed by what the design people in the publishing house come up with. They
It's
That was their
very
interpretation.
cool. It's
So
very cool.
there
I enjoy I like it a lot. I found it really cool. So I'm very intrigued by you. So we're going to start about just diving more into your world. We
Okay.
spoke briefly before I hit record that I've interviewed a handful of neuroscientists. I love the opportunity to learn more about our brains and how we think and process. Um, but your everyday life and a lot of the people listening is probably very different. You work at something called the Uncertainty Lab, and it says here that you study how brains deal with this uncertainty, building models of ourselves and the world around us to guide perception, action, and belief. Sounds fascinating, but tell us more about your work. And I also saw that you were also a visiting fellow of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study and lived there for a year. So, like,
Yep.
take us more into what is your day to day? Like, what are you diving into?
So my day to day, yeah. So day to day, you're right. I'm the director of the Uncertainty Lab, and we're a research group who try to understand how people's minds and brains work. So the day to day of that is we spend quite a lot of our time trying to understand how people experience their everyday lives and turning those into situations we can recreate in the lab. We might then put you in our brain scanner downstairs and try and see what's really happening with the neurons in your head as you think and feel and decide. And from that, we think we have an understanding of why we think the way we do, why different people think differently, and also how our past experiences can have an important role in shaping how we perceive and think about the present.
It's really fascinating. And we're going to talk about how you write that the brain is just a single thing, a scientist. I want to dive into that more. But what sparked your own curiosity in wanting to go down this way? Because when you're
Mm.
deciding, like when you're a student and deciding, like, where am I going to focus my studies? Why this? Like, where did this curiosity within you get sparked?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it probably has a sort of twofold answer, in that I think there is the almost the kind of pure scientific mystery of psychology and neuroscience, which is that, all of us go around every day with this kind of thing inside our head that's roughly got, it's got the same sort of ingredients as a pork chop, but kind of sort of somehow it creates every thought and feeling, every decision, every action we've ever made. And there's something kind of almost mystical about that. And most people just go around never really thinking about that. And people
Hmm.
like me are lucky enough to make a living studying it. So there is that just that sense of wonder as part of it. But I think maybe a more sort of personal half of it is that I think, like lots of people, I have I've had lots of people in my life who are touched by mental illness, say, who, if not mental illness, lots of people know people who think very differently and sometimes who think things that might harm them. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that I like about modern psychology and neuroscience is that it doesn't just treat these sometimes difficult ways of thinking and feeling as if they're just pathologies, but they're things which can be explained. They're things which can often make sense if you think that it's your brain trying to make sense of a sometimes senseless world. And I think that you get a much more humane way of thinking about why people think the way they do and why we all think differently once you do the kinds of studies that me and my colleagues around the world do.
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating. And one of the neuroscientists who came on told me and my audience that our brains don't like uncertainty. Right. So the
No.
fact that you're the director of the Uncertainty Lab, I mean, you're helping to unpack this for the rest of us and maybe make sense so that we feel more of a sense of control in our lives. Is that true?
That's the hope. That's the hope. If we could understand why some people feel uncertain and other people feel confident, we can begin to untangle what's happening in your brain to make that happen. We could get people to feel more confidence that they should feel, and perhaps also we should get people to feel the right level of uncertainty they should feel. You can quite easily imagine some people might be underconfident and other people might be overconfident. And if we know more about how our brains calibrate, but also miscalibrate to the world around us, that can help us understand not just things like psychiatric illness, but also just differences among the population at large.
Absolutely. And I'm curious too, why did you choose to write this book now, and who do you hope it will impact and reach?
Well, I suppose my ambitious hope is that it will be a book about the brain that people who don't usually think books about the brain are for them. I think that while I hope there's stuff there for people who already think that they like popular science, I think fundamentally, as I maybe this kind of preamble suggests, that there's something that all of us can learn once we kind of take this brain's eye view. Once you start to think about how your brain works, it can make some of the strange things that your mind does begin to make sense, but it can also make some of the more everyday things, you'll kind of see the wonder behind them, and that actually some of the seemingly simplest things you do are really some of the most complex.
And I
And
love
you can
that.
have, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to interrupt. And I love
No,
that
no,
in the
not at all.
sense
Not.
of wonder and awe, because one of the neuroscientists who was talking about the implications, it's her book is called Your Brain on Art. She wrote it with, do you know Susan
I know the
Magsamen?
book. Yeah, I don't know her
Yeah,
personally.
love that. I mean, because art is so fundamental to sort of in creating and, it's just to our nature, and knowing that it can actually help extend our lifespan, I thought was fascinating. I mean, this is why it's so fun to talk to neuroscientists, because your specific focuses help us see the world in a different way than we are appreciating it or thinking about it, because it's not where we go day to day.
And I think the conversations are important too, because neuroscientists have this habit sometimes of saying anyone who discovers anything about how we think and feel is a kind of naive neuroscientist. So it's kind of a little bit, I suppose, sort of, I guess it's almost sort of derogatory, but it would be things like great artists or great composers or great musicians. They are just naive neuroscientists because somehow they've
Interesting.
discovered a way to sort of tickle the brain and get a certain response. But I think that we learn just as much from, and I learn just as much from these kinds of conversations with people like you about how we think and feel as you can learn from the lab. I hope it's a harmonizing way of thinking.
Absolutely. And also maybe what I discerned from it too might be curious for you too, like what I took away versus I listened to you on two very sort of technical sciencey podcasts. One was with the BBC, and I was like, this is really interesting. This is going to be a different conversation Daniel's having today. And I'm so grateful because I know the women that listen to my show are deeply curious and they love learning and expanding and also wanting to really have the most fulfilling, rewarding lives. And I think you can't do that without questioning or understanding or being willing to look at things differently. So give us what is a scientist? And so you're saying that the brain is just a single thing, a scientist. We know what it is, but just give us a, because this is foundational. I just want to start foundational now.
Yeah, so you're right that the main thesis of this book is a new way of thinking about you and your brain, and it's saying that your brain is a scientist.
Yes.
And that is intended both as an insult and a compliment. So you can think that, some people like me are sort of scientists all day long. What I'm in the business of is trying to make sense of the world by coming up with theories, running experiments, and then using my theories to make sense of the data that my, environment's giving me.
Yes.
And that process that scientists have refined over centuries is maybe the best way we have to understand the world around us, but it's also not perfect. The kind
Yes.
of the history of science is the history of people who are very intelligent and very careful and very conscientious, still ending up seeing the world through false paradigms. You could have people who would labor for decades and centuries taking conscientious measurements of the heavens above, and they can still end up with the theory that, the sun revolves around the earth rather than the other way around.
Yes.
So I think there's a kind of deep analogy between what people like me do in the lab and also what we all do when we all think about the world around us. We're all trying to come up with our own theories, our own paradigms, our own systems that make sense of the world around us. Those paradigms then kind of become the lens through which everything is seen. But just because your brain's doing its best to come up with its best theory, doesn't mean that theory is always going to be right. You can
Yes.
end up, through no fault of your own, building a theory that doesn't quite match the reality you live in. And that can kind of put a distance, sort of veil between you and everything and everyone else. You always are living inside your brain's best theory, not the world as it really is.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I love this so much too, because like I said, the women are going to be able to relate a lot of things that we feel that like we're not spending time thinking about to our day to day.
Mm.
I'm curious, you say that the philosopher Popper that we live in three worlds at once: the world of matter, the world of minds, and the third is the world of ideas. And your book is structured based around this, as you
Mm.
write. And this book will reveal how the scientist that's your brain puts you in and out of touch with all three. I was curious, did you approach the work with the theory, or did the work remind you of this philosopher? Do you know what I mean? Which came first?
I think probably it's a bit of a duet between both. I think that, as I was saying before, I think that lots of the stuff that we study in science is kind of very much continuous with the way that people think about their everyday life, and that I kind of what I'm trying to explain isn't just, what happens with neurons in a petri dish, but trying to explain how the kind of living human being thinks and decides and feels. And that means understanding often takes you out of science and back in again. So I think that sort of Popper's idea has probably left a deeper impression on me a long time ago, but I keep finding it's a useful metaphor and way of thinking about all the different things your brain's trying to do, and that you live in more than one reality at once.
Absolutely. And I loved the way that you structured it. So what I would love to be able to do though, because I love the way that you structured the book with the part one, part two, and three with uh, you know, each of those sections. The you did part one was the material world, part two, the
Mhm.
mental world, and part three, the world of ideas. So perception. I remember one time working in corporate and I was advocating to get some more resources, which we really needed. And he denied me. The office manager's like, yeah, well, Michelle, unfortunately, perception is reality, and I'm not seeing what you see. And that stayed with me. And
Mm.
you write, perception is porous to these predictions and theories, and your brain begins to perceive what it expects, not just the signals that the world provides you with. This means that seeing is believing, but not in the way that you might usually expect. So let's unpack perception,
Mm.
because for me, that was a lesson in like maybe being more prepared and being able to switch his perception. But yeah, I'd like to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that maybe the sort of starting point is that, like, I guess I like that you picked that quote because there's something quite counterintuitive about it. And that I think
Yes.
usually we think that perception is about seeing things kind of clearly or seeing them as they are. And that means kind of turning your preconceptions off and not having your biases kind of filter into how you're making judgments. But what the science seems to suggest is that while that seems intuitive, that just can't possibly be how we perceive the world around us. That the information that kind of comes into your brain is just so ambiguous and so uncertain. It's compatible with so many different ways the world could be. You need some kind of model, some kind of prior idea, some preconception that you use to structure your experiences.
Mm,
So it's not that you can ever see the world clearly by turning off these kind of preconceptions. You can only see clearly because you've got the right preconceptions. You have to have these kind of shorthand, this theory in your brain to make sense of the complete chaos that's impinging on your eyes and your ears at any given moment.
mm.
So there is a deep truth to that idea that perception is reality because you aren't ever in touch with that raw data from the world around you because you wouldn't want to be. It would just be kind of chaotic. It would be
Yes.
noisy. It would be insane. You wouldn't,
Yes.
you wouldn't want to see the world as it is because it would be complete nonsense. You
Yes.
need these kind of structures to filter it for you, and they become like prisms. It's a bit like how I've got an actual pair of glasses that I put on and it makes me see certain things in certain ways.
Mm,
And it generally clarifies, right? But it's distorting some things and not other things. So you can think that's a good model for how your brain's working. It's distorting things all the time. Sometimes it distorts them to make them more useful, and other times it distorts them to make them less like the world you really live in.
right. And that is informed by our past?
Yeah, so the idea would be that where do you get these theories? Your brain
Right.
builds these theories from past experiences. So the
Mm,
idea is you've inhabited different environments in the past. You can then use the patterns that you've picked up from your previous experiences to make sort of educated guesses about what's going to happen next. You
mm.
could think if this idea your brain's like a scientist, that's kind of what scientists do, right? We kind of look back to evidence from the past, we use that to make
Yes.
some predictions about what should happen next, and then see if those predictions kind of come true. So your brain's constantly in this game of kind of coming up with its best prediction about what's going to happen next, but that can end up coloring your perception in sometimes inaccurate ways. I mean, one one kind of everyday example I think is quite nice
Please.
where you can sort of experience this would be something like when you realize you've been mishearing song lyrics for
I wrote this one
sort of years
down.
and
I was
years,
going to
right? Yeah,
ask
it's
you. I
okay.
love this.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So it's things like, people there's a subset of people who hear things like Jimi Hendrix sings "Excuse me while I kiss this guy" rather than "the sky,"
Hmm.
or people who hear Bob Dylan sing things like "The ants are my friends, they're blowing in the wind," and these kinds of misperceptions they kind of happen because of the way that your brain is kind of constructing its own interpretation. So you can
Yes.
think that, you've had, the first time you listen to that Jimi Hendrix song, you've got a lifetime of experience of what people say and the kinds of things that they mean. And you're bringing that to bear when you're listening to what the other person is saying. And that means that you are projecting your own interpretation, right? And in some ways, though, it's a misperception that makes sense.
Yes.
If you think about how the world really works, it's much more likely that you are kissing this guy than you are kissing the sky, because
Yes.
the sky is not something you can kiss. So you can feel your brain is kind of implanting a kind of probabilistically true, like most likely interpretation into your experience, but you aren't aware of that. You just feel like you're listening and you're hearing. But at any given moment, your brain is inventing its own theories and putting those into your perception, and that's what you're in touch with. So if you take that to the example you were describing before, I think you can have loads of people in a room listening, say, to the same presentation or the same talk, but if
Yes.
they're all tuned to have slightly different theories, they're all literally hearing something different from the same presentation. The
Mm.
signal, the noise in the room is the same,
Yes.
but the interpretation you hear is going to be personalized and it's going to be fit to the theories that your brain's made up from your personal experience, nobody
Okay.
else's.
I love this so much. And this is one of my, I'm so glad you brought this up because I had noted this to bring it up. Okay. So uh, I have like three things that I want to kind of
Sure.
break down with this. I am somebody who consistently mishears lyrics. Like Miley Cyrus, he came in like a wrecking ball. I heard rainbows. He came in like a rainbow. And when my daughter's like, "What are you saying?" I'm like, "Rainbow." She's like, and then I saw the music video, which also
Yeah.
would give my brain more to work with, right? If I'd seen the video, I
Hmm.
never would have heard rainbow. He came in like and it may not even be he came in. It may be something else. Like, so
Yeah.
I'm consistently mishearing lyrics. I don't know what that says about me, but
Yeah, you might need a better neuroscientist than me to explain that one,
I
Michelle.
don't
No, I think
know,
no, I think
but
no, I think no, I think that what it shows you is you have this active theorizing going on, right? You're not
yeah.
just passively listening and saying, "Oh, I sort of don't know what I'm hearing." You're coming up with what is a sensible. Maybe it speaks to your kind of optimism and your
Maybe I
in your
am
kind
an
of worldview.
optimistic person. Yes.
But one thing that I thought was really nice about the example you gave there is you said, had I watched the music video and seen the wrecking ball,
Yes.
it would have disambiguated it for me. I would have known.
100%.
But I think that's a really important insight because while that's true for song lyrics, where you can play them again and again, or you can watch the music video and see what it's really about,
Yes.
you can't actually do that for most of your life, right?
Yes.
If I say something and you mishear it and you misunderstand it,
Yes.
you're not going to get me to say it again. You're just stuck with that one shot impression that you formed, and then
Mm.
your life goes on and you're stuck with that misunderstanding. And so I think that while the song lyrics are a nice example where you realize that you've been mishearing it,
Yes.
maybe the more unsettling thought is maybe you've been mishearing loads of things that you never get the music video, right? You never get the evidence that tells you how you should have been hearing it. And
Totally.
yeah, you can start to think how it's possible that you can have people hearing literally different things in the same room and never realizing because you don't sit and compare notes about every single thing every person's ever said to you.
Yes, but on the positive side of that too, there was a sort of a self-improvement influencer back in the day or whatever, and she said I didn't go to her conference, but she as part of what she was talking about in the promotional stuff, she said you're going to be hearing the same messages from different people, but you're going to hear it from one person and not the other, which is why it's sort of like they all have their own way of interpreting this data
Hmm.
on how for self-improvement. And so is it sort of aligned with what you're talking about too, or no? Does this sort of align?
Well, I think I mean, it's something that I talk a little bit in the book about we talk about things like originality and creativity coming from this
Yes.
process.
Yes.
That on the one hand, it might sound like a bit of it makes you seem a little bit mechanical if I say all you do is you take the past and then you use that to kind of make a filter for the present. It kind of makes it seem like you could never you could never really think anything new because you're always
Yes.
just kind of recycling the things from the past. But
Yes.
actually, if you think for a moment, if what you're really doing is taking your past, your experiences, and then using those as your own unique window onto what's happening right now, that does mean that if you and I have different experiences and different things kind of buried in our brain's theories, we can come up with different interpretations from the same
Yes.
signal. And that
Yes.
begins to look like what originality and creativity is, that we
Hmm.
can each of us can emphasize different parts of the same signal because we're kind of tuned towards different things. And those differences needn't be bad things. And I think in many ways, I think this theory is it's a theory that starts to explain where lots of both diversity and neurodiversity can come from. Because
Yes.
if we're tuned with slightly different theories in slightly different ways, the world will kind of bounce off us all in different ways, and we'll get different kind of resonant notes coming off of different brains. But that doesn't mean that any of us is right or wrong. We have kind of perspectives that are all mutually inaccurate, and we sort of grasp at the truth together.
Right. And so it made me think of the image I got was sort of, let's say you're in a writing class and the professor gives you a writing prompt. You're going to get, and there's 30 students in the room, you're going to get 30 very different
Yeah.
interpretations of what that prompt meant based on your own lens,
Hmm.
right? Or your own,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So I wonder, what about, like, and I don't know if it's technically epigenetics, but what about like let's say you come from a culture that had a lot of past traumas or something.
Hmm.
Is some of that passed on? And so how you interpret the world, is there like almost like a lineage of how you perceive? Do you know what I mean? Not just what you're
Yeah.
taught, because I was going to ask based on some other stuff you wrote with the Pacific Islanders and how they tell they teach
Hmm.
their culture. Don't assume what somebody's thinking you don't know. But I'm
Hmm.
talking about like inherently, like it's in your DNA. I know
Well,
you didn't talk about this in the book specifically, but now I'm curious. Yeah, your
yeah.
thoughts
Well,
on it.
I think that it could be that there are some important genetic and, as you say, sort of epigenetic transmission mechanisms. But one of the things that I again explore a bit in the book is that you needn't it doesn't have to be transmission via some genetic or epigenetic route for it to be possible for us to inherit these kinds of
Ah,
uncertainties and ways of thinking from each other.
yes.
Partly because so much of what we pick up is culturally transmitted
Mm,
through through our parents, through our communities, through the environments we find ourselves in. I think in many ways that's enough to explain the inheritance of certain ideas without there needing to be a kind of extra genetic route. In that
mm,
you could imagine, if your parents have undergone some very significant trauma and that gives them, certain theories about how the world works, it
yeah.
makes them think that the world's a threatening and unstable place,
Yes.
they will behave both explicitly and implicitly towards you as if that's true, right? And even
Yes.
if you find yourself in a very stable environment, you can nonetheless pick up the signals, both explicit and implicit, from your kind of caregivers that you should be nervous, the world's not a stable place. And that's
Mm,
something that we've been looking at the neuroscience of a little bit in my group, where we've been trying to investigate how it's possible for people to just pass on their beliefs about uncertainty just by talking. And in some of our experiments, what we can find is that we can make people believe the exactly the same environment is going to be predictable and trustworthy, or it's going to be unpredictable and unstable, just by telling them this is what you should expect.
yes.
And that expectation becomes a sort of prism through which you see everything else. You start to see, if you think the world's a stable place, you can sort of explain away the ebbs and flows, the kind of noise around the edges. You think, no, there's
Yes.
something consistent going on, and I can ignore the background variability. But if you
Yes.
think the world is a kind of unstable place, you experience it as fluctuating and changing. And I mean, in some of the experiments that we did along these lines, we can find that just these sorts of instructions in healthy volunteers
Mm,
are enough to make people behave just like people who've got paranoid delusions. We can kind
wow.
of get you to behave as if the world is really, really untrustworthy just by having a brief conversation, basically. And I think that,
Yeah.
that's in miniature when we do it in the lab, right? If you imagine what's happening, with your relationship with your parents or other members of your family,
Yeah.
it's not just like some guy in a lab telling you something for a few minutes. repeated experiences and exchanges over and over again, and that will build up the world you think you live in.
Now, you didn't write about intuition in your book specifically, but I I worked with directly for when I was in corporate, three self-made multimillionaires CEOs. They all use gut and intuition.
Mm,
And my sense of intuition, like they talk about mother's intuition, or, you just know stuff sometimes, right? Or whether you're sensing danger or whatever.
hmm
With this idea of like it's past experiences. I talked to this woman actually from Iceland who was talking about insight, which is the Icelandic intuition, which
hmm
is about it just triggered this idea for me. Like she said something about, tapping into like the collective knowledge as well. I know we're going a little deeper now, more
No, 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 no.
philosophical versus like, but I'm curious what your lens is based on what you do, where intuition comes into play. Because is
Mm,
it based on, because a lot of the situations I haven't lived before, but I do have a sense of something.
hmm
And it's
hmm
right, right? My intuition, I always trust that,
Mm.
knowing.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you almost apologize there for talking to me as a serious scientist
I
about the
don't
idea
know
of
because,
intuition.
well,
But
I
I
mean, a
think
little bit.
I think there's a real harmony there though, which is that in some ways, when you talk about this idea of kind of intuitive understanding, or even like the idea of a kind of collective knowledge that you're tapping
Right,
into, I think that
right.
the sorts of stuff that I'm describing in this book it's kind of the science of what makes that possible.
Okay.
Because, I'm when I say, your brain's a scientist and it's making predictions and it's kind of doing its own thing to make sense of your surroundings,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that kind of you as an individual are sitting there thinking, oh, I think the next thing Daniel's going to say is this, and I think that tomorrow the weather's you aren't constantly doing all
Yeah,
this
yeah.
predicting, right? But
Yeah.
it's just a feature of how your mind works. But the work is largely hidden from you, right? And just like in that song lyric example, you're not aware of your brain like trying on every possible interpretation.
Right.
You just get the output at the end.
Yeah,
And I
rainbow.
think, yeah, exactly, rainbow. And I think in some sense, there's a sense that the kind of the intuition that I think you're talking about is a bit like that. It's sort of it's the output of a process that your brain's engaged in, right?
Mm,
It's using
yeah.
the bundle of experiences that you both directly have, but also which you will collectively have through the messages you've imbibed from your culture and from your community. And you'll be
Mm-hmm.
able to draw upon that to make quick, snap interpretations, but they're not coming from nowhere. It's not
Right.
like you're kind of possessed by some spirit that gives you some
Right.
kind of way of thinking.
Right.
It's that mesh of intertangled connections that all kind of hang together in your mind about how things work.
Yes.
And you can access that without sitting and deliberating and thinking. And often those rapid processes, they're not going to be unreliable. They're going to very quickly kind of assay that tangle in your head, that connection of all those networks that give you your belief about how the world works. And so I think that there's nothing spooky about intuition in that sense. It's just
Right. Yeah, no,
mirroring
I
back to you what's hidden in your mind already.
absolutely. And like I said, whether it's CEOs or a mom or whatever, I mean, we all possess this. It seems to be
Hmm.
something that we have access to, but I was just curious. Yeah,
Yeah.
what your lens was, not that it's some woo-woo thing necessarily, but
Well,
that
no,
no, not a,
no,
right.
I don't think it is. I think that insofar as your brain's got useful models buried in it that you can't kind of consciously bring to mind, it's going to be
Yes.
possible for you to sometimes be surprised by what your own mind comes up with. But
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that what it's coming up with is woo woo. It's in the
Right.
if in some ways I think that, for instance, people in my position are they're a bit anxious about talking about things like unconscious or subconscious understandings. There's a sort of anxiety that it makes you sound like we haven't moved on since Sigmund Freud or something.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there is a deep kernel of truth to this idea, right? But I mean, the only reason people like me have a job is because we don't know how all of our bits of our mind and brain work, and we can't just sit back and think to make sense of it. We need
Right.
to kind of plumb those hidden depths scientifically, but that means I'm really, scientifically committed to the idea that there are bits of your brain and my brain that are kind of hidden from each of us. But that doesn't mean they're not doing
Absolutely.
things, right? Their outputs can still present back to us in our thoughts and our behavior. And maybe that's close to what intuition is.
One of the parts that I absolutely loved in the book was the Matthew effect.
Hmm.
Okay, so you wrote about how successes and failures shape our picture of ourselves, and you tell the story of Prasher who missed out on winning the Nobel Prize. You'll tell us the story, but by the way, the guys that won, I don't understand how it all works, but why they wouldn't have included him, I don't like. I would have picked up the phone and been like, "Hey, we picked up your work," because he handed it off to the guys that did win the Nobel Prize for his
Hmm.
work. Like that bothered me a little bit. I'm not gonna because I was like, but the important part of that story is like you write, where do these beliefs about ourselves come from? How is it that some of us can doggedly persist in the face of failure and rejection, but others, like Prasher, can have an idea genuinely worthy of a Nobel Prize, but fail to see their own talent? This again was on sort of the metacognition, but this is relatable to so many people. The
Hmm.
invitation with the show is to invite women off the sidelines. You have the dream of writing the book, pursue that. You know, somebody may have been very successful in their career and then became a stay at home mom and wants to re enter. They don't
Hmm.
have the confidence. So, what can we learn from this Prasher story? I found
Yeah.
it really interesting and also heartbreaking for that guy. I was like, why didn't
Hmm.
they just let him get the recognition he worked so hard to
Well, I think,
deserve?
but yeah, no, I think that's right. I think so. What this story illustrates is a kind of essential problem that your brain has, which is it's a kind of analogy of that perception one. So in the same way that you can never easily perceive exactly what the outside world is like, you need to have a kind of theory to make sense of it. The same thing is true of yourself, that you can't ever just understand yourself and your own mind and your own abilities directly. You need to have a kind of theory or a story that you tell yourself about who you are and what you can do to make it possible to kind of read your own mind.
Right.
And the story of Douglas Prasher, I think, as I'm so glad you liked it because I think it does kind of make this really kind of hits the nail on the head.
Oh,
Is
yes.
he was this so I think it was in 2008 the sort of Nobel Academy announced that they would give the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the kind of discovery of something called green fluorescent protein, which was originally in some kinds of squid. It's kind of glow in the dark thing.
Hmm.
And sort of scientists were able to kind of transport this protein, use it to kind of image glow in the dark lots of different cells in other animals. And it had a whole host of kind of applications in advanced medical science in lots of ways. And one of the people that kind of initially worked on isolating this protein was a guy called Prasher. And when the call came from the Nobel Academy, he wasn't, running his own lab as a distinguished professor, resting on his laurels with his great successes. At the time that this news was announced, he was working as a courtesy car driver for a Toyota dealership in Alabama, having fallen out of science completely, having left academia and research and passing on, as you said, the work to other colleagues who did different things. Um, before you get too nervous about people taking all the credit, the people who were winners, they did actually invite Prasher to go to the ceremony with them.
Oh, they
So
did?
while he
Oh,
didn't,
that's
while he
good to
didn't,
hear.
while he didn't get the prize, they did, I think, bring him and his wife
That's
to the kind
nice.
of prize to the prize
That's
banquet.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think that, but what's yeah, as you say, the kind of the way that I kind of write about it in the book is to think, here's something which it literally is a project that wins the Nobel Prize, but the kind of guy who's instrumental to coming up with the idea, he's not the one getting the prize. He's decided, I'm not gonna pursue this. I'm gonna go and leave science, do something else.
Yes.
And I think that what that kind of illustrates quite keenly is this sense that you can objectively be very good and very capable, but it might not always feel that way, and you might not always
Yes.
have those beliefs embedded in your brain that give you that confidence to keep on trying. And so Prash is one kind of particularly vivid example, but there are some sort of examples in the book I talk about which are a bit more, it kind of looks at the kind of the sort of some of the evidence behind this. And one example actually again looks at scientists and how their careers go. But I think there's a good kind of analogy here for lots of different areas of kind of working life. They looked at particularly Dutch scientists, where there's a kind of very well-established route that you go through in your career, which is, they have these kind of three different kind of funding grant schemes, which they call Veni Vidi Vici. as
Oh,
in sort of
funny. I came, I
users
saw, I
like I
conquered.
came
Yeah.
myself conquered, yeah. And so you could think by the end of your career you should be conquering, but when you're a junior scientist, it's okay to just be coming and seeing. So this first grant, the kind of Venni grant, is the one that you start applying for as your first kind of step to independence.
Mm,
So it's people who say just finished their PhDs, they're kind of coming out of grad school, they're wanting to set up their own research groups. This is the thing you would apply for. And how most of these sort of funding bodies work is lots of people apply, they rank all the applications, and then they decide afterwards how many they can fund. So you might rank everybody 1 to 100, and then you look at how much money you've got and you say, we'll fund the top 20. If you do that, of course, the person at the top of the list is probably really good,
yeah,
but you can have people that will just kind of just get the grant or just miss out. And you can think there's probably not much in it between the person who's ranked 20th and 21st.
of course.
But if they draw the line at 20, one person's successful and one person fails.
Yes.
And what the researchers found was that, yeah, this idea of the Matthew effect, this effect where the kind of the rich get richer, happens in this kind of professional sphere. That the people who just win their first grant, they end
Hmm.
up to win more and more and more grants over the kind of early years of their career compared to
Yeah.
those people who miss out.
Yes.
And you can think that part of the reason for that is what success or failure kind of does to those self-beliefs. It does to those models of how good you are and what you should and shouldn't kind of try to do. One way you can see that happening is because the gap between the kind of early winners and the early losers really begins to shrink if you look at the losers who kept applying. So the people who continued to, maybe they were surrounded by networks of people who continued to encourage them.
Yes.
Maybe they had kind of personal relationships that allowed them to continue to kind of cling on to the idea that they were talented and had something work that was worth doing.
Yes.
But for reasons that, the researchers don't know, some people kept applying and the gap, there was still a gap, but it was much smaller. So it
Interesting.
seems that there's this connection between the way that succeeding gives you confidence about the future, which kind of energizes you to try, which then let you succeed, and then you continue. Whereas the kind of opposite, more kind of vicious cycle would be one where you initially fail, you find it difficult just through misfortune,
Yes.
but that lowers your confidence. That makes it harder for you to continue to try because you think, what's the point in trying if I'm going to fail?
Right.
But if you stop trying, you never get the prediction error. You never get the thing that said, "Oh, actually, maybe I'm better than I thought I was. Maybe if I was forced to try, I would succeed." And I think this kind of gets to a deep issue in how we think about ourselves, which is that we can have a sense of our own abilities, but it's hard for us to kind of fraction out what is really us and what's just been the kind of vagaries and vicissitudes of our lives. That you might think if you have kind of, for want of a better phrase, had it easy and had lots of advantages,
Yes.
that that looks the same from a kind of first person perspective as being really talented and thinking everything I
Ah,
try, I succeed.
yes.
Whereas vice versa, if you find yourself, up against lots of different kinds of sort of structural or systemic obstacles, you find that it's harder for you to achieve things than other people. You might not diagnose that as a kind of problem with the world, but as a problem with you. And
Mm,
that's a kind of it's not right. You are capable. You are able to do the things that you'd like to do, but it's perfectly rational for your brain to come up with that theory, right? Because it's all
yes.
your brain's got to go on. If you keep getting knocked back, it would be irrational for your brain to tell you, "Oh no, you're great, keep going." But
Right.
in some sense, you need to have this view of yourself from a kind of third person perspective, because that first person perspective you get from your own brain, it's not always going to be helpful or reliable.
No. How do we cultivate that though? Because you
Well,
mentioned having people that support you. That's outside your head.
yeah, there it is. It is. I think so. I think one, it's not so much a strategy, but I think it's an insight. I think is that you shouldn't trust your kind of inner monologue too much.
Ah,
In that
interesting.
both in terms of confidence and underconfidence. That I
Mm,
think that
yes.
if it's the case that these you're usually kind of, trying to use your feelings of confidence when you're kind of anticipating doing something, right? And
Mm.
when you're doing that kind of anticipation, it's going to be based on those past models of the past experiences. And I don't want to suggest that like where everyone is in life is all completely random and there's no such thing as talent and everybody who's successful just got it by random luck. I think, but there's an element of you don't ever really know how much of your kind of career trajectory to date has been to do with your kind of intrinsic talents and the conditions you found yourself in certain points in time.
100%.
And so you shouldn't take it too seriously when you try to anticipate the future. You should think, just because I'm a bit uncertain about whether I should apply for that, or as you said, should write that book or should go back to that career.
Right.
Those feelings are not going to be infallible. I'm not saying they're wrong, but they're just
Yeah.
not always going to be a helpful friend that's kind of guiding you towards the truth. They'll just be guiding you towards where you already think you are. And
Yes.
if that's a pessimistic place, then you're going to be brought back into that kind of pessimistic gravity, and you need to detach somehow to get to it. I think maybe something a bit more kind of practical
Please.
is something that comes from some of the work we've done about how we seemingly can inherit the certainty or uncertainty from people around us. And so, one of the things that we've been exploring in my lab lately is the idea that people don't just learn from their own experiences about how certain they should feel or how confident they should feel, but they learn from the people that are around them.
Mm.
And one of the things that, it's been known for quite a while that in kind of group situations, people can change the way they express their confidence. That if you get people in a room, we tend to follow the person who's expressing the most confidence. And so you can sort of strategically weaponize your confidence to kind of get more influence. So you might start to
Interesting.
exaggerate something if you want to be listened to, or you might kind of downplay your confidence if you don't want your reputation to be at risk. But what we've begun to find in our own work is that when you get people in these group situations with people who have different levels of confidence to them, it doesn't just change the way they talk, but it changes the way they really feel. If I get you to start working with someone who's much more confident than you, the confidence you express begins to increase, but that effect continues even when that person goes away. You
Wow.
still feel as though your confidence has changed from that interaction. And likewise, through people who are paired with someone who's more uncertain. If you have someone who's more kind of prevaricating and expressing low confidence in their actions and choices, that also kind of, has a contagious effect on you. And you start to think, well, if their confidence is so low, maybe I shouldn't be so cocky. Maybe I should, sort of, moderate myself too. And it's something that we're kind of doing more work on. It's not something that's by any means a kind of um, closed chapter just yet. But one reason I think this is an important line of work is because I think this could be something that creates the sorts of cultures of confidence that we have in the world around us. There's evidence, for instance, that I don't know, that kind of politicians express more confidence than scientists, or that people who work in finance tend to express more confidence than everybody else, or if the evidence was needed, that men express more confidence than women.
Yes.
And you can think that those sort of social patternings, they could, if what our work is showing is right, they'll also begin to change how people feel depending on the groups that they sort of belong to. If
Mm.
it's like generally true that men express more confidence than women, and it's also generally true that men spend more time with men and women more time with women, then this kind of mechanism I'm describing, where you kind of inherit the confidence of those around you, will mean that you will find yourself imitating that uncertainty that's like the people that you're with. Yeah, there's this adage that often comes out, sort of particularly in these like sort of CEO kind of self-help things that, you're the
Yes.
average of the 10
Five
people
people.
you spend time
Yeah.
with. Like, well,
Yeah.
this idea kind of,
Hmm.
we're suggesting has some real sort of scientific grounding to it because
That's
you
fascinating.
are finding yourself shaped by the people you're interacting with. So I'm not saying that you should, if you find yourself pessimistic about the future, you should get new friends. But I suppose you should think about how much the people around you are shaping those perspectives. And if there are people who you admire the way that they confidently approach the world, you might want to spend more time interacting with them because whether it's conscious or not, what our work suggests is that you'll be learning from the people around you what confidence is appropriate and how maybe some of the uncertainty you feel should be suppressed and put back in its box, and you should begin to resemble more the people who are outside your own head.
It's so fascinating. Is there anything though that I didn't ask you today that you like I really want to leave Michelle's audience with? I mean, your book is so rich and deep. So we obviously just covered a couple, a few things here, but
Mm.
anything that comes to mind?
We didn't talk too much about the sort of social other mind side, which
Please.
you kind of bent towards when you said you liked stuff about the kind of Pacific Islanders. But I suppose one of the things that I try to draw out in the book is not just that the kind of the world is kind of hidden and confusing and ambiguous, but often one of the things that is hardest for us to kind of properly understand and get inside is the heads of other people. And I sort of like this idea that maybe we can learn a lot from in our kind of personal relationships, we can learn a lot from the kind of science of uh, extraterrestrial life. In that, I think when you think about how scientists kind of try to understand life on other planets, we don't ever kind of go there. We don't just get in a spaceship and go to a distant galaxy and see what life's like over there. What we do is we kind of look from afar and we kind of take our measurements and we try and kind of use a model of what we think life would be like based on our sense of what life's like here on Earth. We kind of think, oh, if there's water there, life could be like that, or if it's too hot, life could be like that. But it's always kind of through the lens of what our own planet's like. And I
Yes.
think that's exactly what's happening when we try to understand each other. That, we say things in everyday language like, to walk in someone else's shoes or to get inside their head, but we never really do that. They're always a sort of distant planet, and we're
Interesting.
only seeing the behavior on the surface. And we're trying to make sense of what the kind of life's like on the ground from just the kind of atmosphere that surrounds them. And I think that that same process, we've spoken about it a bit today in terms of how you understand the world and yourself, but I think it also affects how you make sense of other people because once you begin to realize that you aren't ever really seeing the others around you as they really are, but through the lens of that own interpretation, it can start to make some bits of miscommunication make more sense.
Yes. And we connect with or feel like we understand people who are more like ourselves.
Yeah, even down to, I mean, I talk about it in the book, but even down
Yes.
to
I
really
loved this
quite kind
part
of
of the book.
fundamental things like how we read each other's body language.
Yes.
That, in a sense, body language is a bit of a misnomer. It's more like we all speak a whole different bunch of like body dialects, and it's tuned to the way that your body moves. That,
Yes.
if you and I have different shaped and sized bodies, we're going to move differently. And that means that when we express ourselves and our thoughts and our feelings, those expressions will literally look different. And what some of the research I've been involved in suggests is that you can actually more easily read the emotions of people that kind of emote in the way that you do. And
Yes.
that's not just a kind of scientific curiosity. I mean, one of the things that we see in some of this work is that it can begin to explain or shed some light, for instance, on why maybe teenagers and their parents might clash. Because there's this kind of pattern that you can see in the data, which is that kind of as your body grows through childhood to early adolescence to adulthood, it just begins to slow down. And that's just a sort of biomechanical factor, right? Like it gets bigger, so it gets kind of heavier to move.
Yes.
But that means that you do move different in a meaningfully different way when you're an adolescent to when you're an adult. And so your emotions will just look different. But those differences aren't embedded in the minds of the people that are interacting. So you can have these situations where, like, if you're a sort of relatively slow moving adult interacting with a kind of fast moving adolescent teenager, you look at them and you look at their perfectly neutral behavior and it looks kind of exuberant and aggressive and excited, but they don't really feel anything in particular. Whereas they look at you and you look kind of unbelievably slow and sluggish as if something's gone terribly wrong. And you can see how, two people that don't feel anything in particular in that kind of patterning, it then becomes possible, you say to your child, why are you so angry? And they're not angry. And they say to you, why are you so upset? And you're not really upset. And it's not because either of you is kind of not trying to understand each other. It's because literally the language you're speaking isn't perfectly calibrated,
Yeah.
and it becomes a kind of recipe for misunderstanding.
Absolutely. And the part that I noted when I was reading that, my husband and I went out to dinner the other day. You can sit outside in San Diego and you can bring your dog, but there were no other dogs there. And I'm somebody who smiles a lot and likes to engage with people. And we were sitting down and I saw this couple and the guy had no expression. I read it as he was angry and he kept looking down at our dog. And then our dog sort of wandered off to the table behind us with this other couple. And the woman didn't smile. And I'm like, oh my God. I was like, we have to keep him, he lied down and everything. The end of the night, the couple comes over, the first one, the angry looking man. He's
Hmm.
like, your dog is so beautiful. We're about to adopt one. The other woman, I'm like, I'm so sorry. I hope he wasn't bothering you. She's like, oh my God, we love it so much. He's so cute. I was
Yeah.
complete, and I consider
Yeah.
myself somebody who can read a room. No, I was
Yeah. Yeah.
misinterpreting all the things happening around us because in my head I was thinking, oh, maybe they, it's like maybe my cultural bringing, maybe that's rude. You shouldn't
Mm,
have the dog, you
mm,
wouldn't, and
mm.
you know what I mean? So it was very interesting. I completely misread it, and everyone loved him. They just wanted to come over and pet him.
Yeah, and I think there's a truth to what you said there, right? Which is that you think you're the kind of person that can read a room. We're all the kind of people that can read a room if it's a room of people who are like us,
Yeah, that
right?
right, that
And it's
process like me and
that,
smile
yeah,
when they see
yeah,
someone or
exactly,
they see the
exactly.
dog. I smile when I see a dog. So I
Yeah,
just misinterpreted. I misinterpreted it just like I did with the
yeah.
Miley Cyrus song.
Yeah, and there's a similarity, right? In that just like with the music video thing, you off like that was a nice example where you could go and kind of interview those people afterwards and see what they really like thought
Yeah.
and felt.
Thankfully
But
they came
often,
over. Yes.
but in lots of other cases, right, it would just be
No.
like ships in the night. You'll just make an interpretation about someone, and that's it. That's all you get.
Right.
But
And
there's a powerful sense in which that really there's sort of no such thing as a first impression, if this way of thinking is right. That
interesting. So
it's
that
more.
expression is what is it about for it's you can't you never get a second chance to make a first impression, but your
Mm,
first impression of someone is always right. I've learned that that's not true.
yeah, it's much more the case that when just like how in the song lyrics you're bringing the sound that's playing with your preconceptions, that's also true when you interact with someone else. That you and I haven't met before. And so you might think that you're just building your picture of who I am based on this conversation, but you're not, right?
Yes.
You've made some judgments about the kind of person you think I am based on
Yes.
people in your past who are similar to me, and that's the lens that you're kind of seeing me through. And
It's
and me,
fascinating.
you. It's not. But it's in some ways it's a very effective way to make sense of one of the most confusing things in the world, which is other people. We sort of try to
Yes.
think these people are like people that I have known in the past, but that's that's usually helpful, but it's going to lead to problems if the sample of people that you've kind of trained your brain on doesn't capture that rich diversity of what the world's really like. That you're
Mm,
not going to be able to read people who are not like the people you've met before. And that's, I think, something that, again, extols the virtue of this kind of diversity. That it's not just something that you should think of as a kind of political or ethical buzzword, but it's something which has a meaningful effect on the way that your brain understands its environment because you can only understand situations that your kind of models and theories and paradigms can capture. And if you haven't had that diversity in the experiences you've had so far, you're going to be narrow. You're going to only be able to read certain kinds of rooms and not
so
others.
true. And so we should do what? Meet as many people as we can, not make
I think so.
assumptions, read books. I don't know. Tell us, like, just give us
Yeah,
some
well, I think
tactical
I
thing, tangible things
well,
we could do.
yeah, spending time with other people in, sort of as you said, like physically, like actually broadening the kinds of people that you interact with. But I
Yes.
think the thing you said there about sort of reading books is also a really good example of ways that you can access other people's perspectives that might not be much like your own. But I suppose that it can often be a bit uncomfortable, but wanting to be confronted with perspectives that are not like your own and people that are not like the people that you might, as you said, have preconceptions that you think that you'd want to spend time with, in that if this way of thinking is right, it's always going to feel easier and more fluid
Mm,
to interact with people who fit the models you already have.
yes.
But then that is going to be a bit of a kind of self-fulfilling sort of echo chambery type effect that you're going
Yes.
to get better and better at reading the minds and behavior and actions of a particular kind of thin slice of people, and you'll
Yes.
leave all the people you're not interacting with, yeah, at the door.
Right. Which impacts humanity, which I care about deeply, right? And our
I mean, who
ability to
doesn't?
connect
Yeah.
with one another. What's who doesn't? Well, I don't know. I think maybe some people don't. That
Yeah.
connects us. That connects us. Daniel, thank you for taking the time to be here. I've loved this conversation so much. Ladies, the book is called A Trick of the Mind by Dale. And do you pronounce it Jan?
Yon, yeah. Yeah.
by Daniel Yan with this very cool cover. Where would I direct people who are interested in learning more about you, the work you do, your book? Where should I direct them, Daniel?
Well, you can find me on all major social media channels, but also through the lab's website or through Birkbeck University of London. You can learn more about our latest work and also the current book and also things that might be coming on the horizon soon.
Okay, and I'll link all of that in the show notes, which the women can access directly from their podcast player. Thank you for, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time
Thank
to
you. No,
be
it's been
here.
lovely. Yeah, it's been great.
Yes, thank you. And I'm excited to see what you work on next. I love what you're doing in the world. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Likewise. Thanks,
Thank
Michelle. It's
you.
great.
Thank you so much.